They called it a triumph. After Ulanor, when the last orc warlord lay broken beneath the banners of the Imperium, the legions gathered not for war, but for glory. Titans stood at idle attention across the fields. Vox networks transmitted parades to systems light years away. The sky of Ulanor Prime shimmered under artificial auroras cast by orbiting ships. But amid all the color and sound, something else lingered, quietly, without fanfare. A goodbye. For while the galaxy celebrated its greatest victory, the master of mankind prepared to disappear. The Emperor, silent architect of the Great Crusade, had reached a crossroads. Ulanor had been more than just a campaign. It had been a threshold, and standing upon it, the Emperor looked out, not upon the stars yet to be conquered, but inward, toward Terra, toward his ultimate purpose. The crusade was not finished, but for him it was time to leave. His decision, like much about him, was cloaked in silence. He offered no grand explanation, no counsels of clarification. He simply declared the appointment of a war master, Horus Lupercal, first captain of the Lunar Wolves, victor of countless campaigns, and, some whispered, his favored son. The announcement shocked even the other primarchs, not because Horus was undeserving, none could argue his brilliance or loyalty, but because none of them had been consulted. Not Robute Gilliman with his empire of order, not Rogel Dorn, the eternal sentinel, not Sanguinius, whose nobility shone brightest even in darkness. The Emperor had made his choice, and then he left. To the galaxy he had returned to Terra, to his children he had vanished. The War Master's ascension was meant to unify, but unity, when built on wounded pride, is fragile, and the Emperor's silence left too many spaces for resentment to grow. Some of the primarchs wondered what they had done wrong. Others began to question whether their father still believed in them at all. On Terra, the Emperor's return was no homecoming. He did not walk the Imperial Palace as he once had. He did not meet with the High Lords or offer speeches to the Terran masses. He descended into the subterranean vaults, below even the deepest sanctums of the Mechanicum, into a place few had ever seen and fewer still understood. There, behind adamantium gates and psychic wards, the Emperor began work on a project he had conceived before the first stone of the palace had been laid. The Webway Project. He did not announce it. He did not explain it. He simply began. To his sons, it felt like abandonment. After centuries of conquest side by side, the Emperor's absence created a silence louder than any war cry. The primarchs, engineered for loyalty, found themselves navigating the stars without the compass of their father's presence. And Horus, the newly appointed War Master, bore the weight of expectation. At first, he led with fire. He honored the title. He united the legions, managed distant campaigns, handled diplomacy and discipline alike. He spoke often of his father's vision, of the need to uphold the ideals of unity and enlightenment. But inside him, the seeds of doubt had already taken root. Why had his father left? Why had he entrusted so much, yet shared so little? What was he building beneath the surface of Terra that mattered more than the fate of the galaxy? Back on Ulanor, where the ashes of war still cooled beneath the banners of triumph, a monument was raised in the Emperor's name. A spire of gold and obsidian, taller than any built by human hands before it, meant to celebrate his victory and eternal legacy. But he never saw it. The Emperor never returned to Ulanor. He had already gone below. Already disappeared into the labyrinthine veins of Terra to begin work on something far greater and far more perilous than any battlefield. A task that required his undivided will, a task that demanded he leave the rest to others. The appointment of Horus was not made out of sentiment nor favoritism. It was a calculated necessity. The Emperor had seen what lay ahead. He had walked the shores of the future in dreams and psychic echoes. He knew that the Eye of Terror would not sleep forever, that the gods of the warp would not stand idle as mankind ascended, and that the power he needed to confront them, to close the door forever, could not be forged on a battlefield. It had to be built, in silence, in secret. So he entrusted the Great Crusade to his sons, and in doing so began the most dangerous gamble of his long existence. Would they stay true? Would they understand? Would they hold the galaxy together long enough for him to finish the great work? The answer was not his to give. It would be tested in fire, in betrayal, in blood. But that comes later. For now, as Terra's sun rose and fell, unnoticed by the one who ruled it, the Emperor returned not to power, but to burden. To labor in darkness beneath the surface of all things. To build the future. Alone, in the black silence beneath the Imperial Palace, far below the thundering footsteps of Terra's surface, the Emperor of mankind worked alone. This place was not a throne room. It was not a war council. It was not even a sanctuary. It was a crucible, ancient, sealed, and lit only by artificial sun lamps and the shimmer of psychic fire. This was the Dark Vault, the heart of the Emperor's final gamble, the Webway Project. To those few who even knew of its existence, it seemed less a project and more a heresy of ambition. To carve a tunnel into a dimension that even the Eldar, ancient, decadent, and long fallen, could barely master. To tame it, to build within it a path untainted by chaos. It sounded impossible, because it was, but the Emperor did not operate within the boundaries of what was considered possible. The Eldar Webway had existed for millennia before humanity learned to harness fire. It was a labyrinthine dimension between real space and the warp, a winding network of impossible angles and timeless tunnels that allowed for travel across the stars without touching the madness of the warp itself, where warp travel was imprecise, maddening, and vulnerable to the demonic. The Webway was fast, safe, and pure, at least in theory. The Eldar once used it to traverse their empire. Now it was shattered, fragmented, leaking at the edges. The Emperor knew that if humanity was to rise above the warp's seduction, above the grip of the Chaos Gods, it had to find a new path. And so he had begun to build his own Webway gate, anchored beneath the palace. Not through reverse engineering Eldar tech alone, but by reshaping the rules of reality itself. The Golden Throne, the device which would become his prison, had not been built to sustain his life. That was a secondary function, born of desperation. No, it had originally been designed as a dimensional stabilizer to pin a human-made entrance into the Webway open and protected from the horrors of the Imperium. And it had worked. At first, it had taken decades to prepare. Every microbeam of the throne's lattice, every psychic attunement, every sacrificial frequency, all tuned to the Emperor's own mind. He didn't just command the Webway breach. He was its anchor. Custodes guarded the gate. The Sisters of Silence stood vigil, their null aura damping the thinness of the veil. The Mechanicum, or at least the narrow sects permitted access, worked under his gaze, integrating arcane machinery beyond anything humanity had ever touched. Together, they carved corridors through unreality. They built void paths from Terra outward, slashing through dimensions the Eldar themselves had left in ruin. The Emperor envisioned a network spanning the Imperium, Sol to Prospero, Macragge to Mars, even beyond the Segmentum Solar. No more warp storms, no more Geller fields, no more demons. Just light, just order, just control. The irony was bitter. To save mankind, the Emperor had to disconnect it from the very forces that had once elevated it. Psychic mutation, the raw power of the warp. All of it had to be suppressed, managed, not embraced. That was why he had forbidden the use of sorcery. That was why he had silenced Magnus's experiments, why he had curbed the Librarius project. He had seen what reliance on the warp would bring, not just power, but addiction, and through addiction, corruption. The Webway project was his alternative. It would let psychers exist, as tools, not as priests, as stabilizers, not as prophets. Humanity would be psychic, but not enslaved to the warp. But the work required everything, all of his focus, all of his strength. Every moment spent away from the project was a moment the rift might collapse, or worse, spread. He had not merely withdrawn from the crusade out of trust, he had no choice. But time was the enemy. The warp was watching, it knew. The gods of chaos, those sentient vortices of hatred, ambition, change, and decay, had already begun to understand his design. They had been too late to destroy him during the dark age of technology, too weak to challenge him during unification. But now, as his back was turned, they saw their opening. They began to push. Reality around the Webway breach began to bend. Unstable echoes rang down the passages the Emperor had carved. Sections of the Webway cracked, revealing things that had no name, creatures that had no form, but existed in hungry potential. The Golden Throne held, just barely, but it needed more. More energy, more vigilance, more of him. He slept less. He spoke rarely. To those around him, the Emperor became something less like a man and more like a burning idea, one that seared the minds of those who tried to understand it. The custodies who served near the breach did so without question, but not without fear. The Sisters of Silence felt the warp's unease, even if they could not hear its whispers. And the Mechanicum priests. They stared too long into the stabilizing lens arrays, and sometimes never blinked again. The Emperor never stopped. He worked through agony, through psychic feedback that would kill thousands. He reached his mind into the corridors of the Webway and shaped them like clay. He saw through walls of unreal light, through fractures in dimensions that had no axis. He held the future in his hands, but he could not hold it forever. The project was nearly complete. The soul nexus, the central artery of the new Webway, was ready to link to its first outbound gate. If the next sequence succeeded, travel between Terra and Mars could be accomplished without the warp. A gateway to Mars, secure and clean. The first of many. It was close, so close. And then, something broke. A scream in the warp, a ripple, sudden, bright, and catastrophic, and with it, the gate began to collapse, not from failure, not from weakness, from violation. Someone the Emperor had warned, had opened a psychic channel across time and space, a son, Magnus. But that is not this chapter's tale. This moment, here, now, is the peak of the Emperor's hope, the razor's edge of what might have been. For in this hidden chamber beneath the palace, the Emperor was not resting. He was building salvation. He did not know, not yet, that the heresy had already begun. To most of mankind, the Imperial Palace was a monument, a city fortress that stretched across the Asian continent and soared beyond the clouds. Its golden towers, blackened by the smoke of endless industry, shimmered like myth in the minds of citizens across the Imperium. But those were only the upper levels, the surface, the lie. The Emperor's true labor did not take place in the light. His true work was buried far below, in chambers so deep the bedrock of Terra groaned with pressure, in vaults where silence was absolute and light was optional. This was not a throne room. It was not even a battlefield. It was a workshop, the most important workshop in human history. Here, reality was not observed. It was altered. Within this cryptic realm, the Emperor toiled not with hammers or data slates, but with raw principles, the invisible codes and ancient laws that underpinned the universe itself. He had no need for blueprints. They existed only in his mind. designs scrawled in concepts far older than language. Here, within the massive arched vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, he reshaped the future with a thought, a gesture, or a single word of High Gothic so pure it had never been spoken aloud by another living thing. This was not industry. This was creation. The chamber's walls pulsed with psychically reactive materials imported from Mars and worlds long dead. Its floors were inscribed with non-Euclidean symbols, each one burned into the stone by the Emperor himself, using nothing but thought and will. At its center sat the Golden Throne, inert, silent, and humming with dormant potential. Not yet a seat of decay, but a machine of hope. Surrounding it were smaller constructs, hundreds of them, each a node in the Emperor's secret network. Dimensional anchors, psychic regulators, webway stabilizers, and energy converters that channeled the will of the throne into usable, controlled output. And beside all of them stood the Emperor. Not a monarch now, but a craftsman, a maker of miracles. He rarely spoke during this time, not because he had no words, but because his work allowed no distraction. Each component of the throne was a balance of paradoxes, solid and liquid, real and theoretical, psychic and material. To maintain them required absolute focus. He worked with the Sisters of Silence in near-total psychic quiet. The custodies who guarded him knew better than to interrupt. Even Malcador, the only mortal permitted direct access, stood back and observed rather than interfere. The Emperor did not sleep. He did not eat. What nourishment he required was drawn from the Imperium itself, not consumed as a psyker would, but tamed, broken into usable form, like a predator lashed to his will. This was not sustainable, but it was necessary. He moved through the chambers with grace, but not haste. Each step calculated, each movement deliberate. When he extended his hand, he wasn't merely reaching, he was layering reality, guiding energy down prepared pathways of thought and form. No mortal scientist could follow the logic, no priest of Mars could comprehend the nuance. They worshipped technology. He commanded it, not in code, but in truth. He did not build as the Mechanicum built. He did not trust in the Omnissiah or await divine inspiration from machine spirits. The Emperor was the Omnissiah, not a god, but a being so advanced he might as well have been one. The webway portal, the throne, the dimensional regulators. These were not machines. They were expressions of his will, frozen in time. Every component held meaning. A copper inlay etched in the exact geometry of the 12-fold path. A plasteel lattice tuned to resonate with the psychic harmonics of Saturn's moon, Iapetus. Runes inscribed in the language of the Old Ones, not to invoke, but to repel. And at the center, the throne itself, a monument of gold and suffering, wrapped in restraint and possibility. At this stage, it was not yet a prison. It was a conduit. A gate. He was building a highway for mankind's soul, one that would bypass the warp entirely. No more corruption, no more demon-slaying rituals, just order. Clean, eternal, and absolute. But beneath the progress, he knew the risks. The workshop was secure, guarded by the most loyal of his custodes, hidden beneath miles of adamantium and gravitic shielding. The Adeptus Custodes had culled entire research teams on Mars just for asking the wrong questions. The vaults were psychically cloaked, mechanically locked, and spiritually warded. Still, the Emperor could feel it. Pressure building. The warp was watching. Something old and dark was pressing against the edges of what he was building. Not with brute force, but with poison, with temptation, with whispers. He ignored them. He had long since learned the voices of the warp had no power over him unless he listened, but that did not mean his sons would be so resistant. Even as he layered one more strand of psycho-reactive crystal into the core regulators, He felt the shadows lengthen. He could sense the divisions forming in the legions. Not clearly, his attention was too focused, but distantly, like a fire you only recognize by the smoke that seeps under your door. He had trusted Horus, not blindly but strategically. The War Master had been chosen to lead in the Emperor's absence so that he might finish the webway. But in placing that trust, he had also isolated the rest. Fulgrim, Angron, Perturabo, even Magnus. The weight was growing heavier. He did not stop working. He could not. The workshop bore witness to the strain. Psychic flashes lit the walls like lightning behind stained glass. Cables melted from the heat of raw soul energy passing through them. Entire constructs imploded under the weight of false readings and dimensional backlash. But the Emperor adapted. Each failure was a signal, each collapse, a recalibration. This was not guesswork. It was trial by enlightenment. He was so close. Just a few more adjustments and the prototype corridor would open fully. A bridge through the webway to Mars, stable and invisible to the warp. He could feel it. He had done it. The moment came. He initiated the sequence. The nodes lit. The crystals sang. The warp was held at bay. And then, something shattered. It wasn't in the room. It wasn't even in real space. It was psychic. A rupture, uninvited, uncontrolled, and unmistakable. A gate had been opened. A voice had reached him. Magnus. The warning would come. The damage would follow. But for now, the Emperor stood in his workshop, amid sparks, smoke, and failure, knowing only this. He had come so close to delivering mankind from its curse. And now the veil had torn. He had called Horus son, not just in word, but in soul. Of all the primarchs, Horus had been found first. Raised by wolves on the blasted world of Chthoniya, tempered by cruelty and clawed from the depths of gang warfare, Horus had transcended his beginnings. When the Emperor arrived to reclaim him, there had been no resistance, only recognition. The moment they stood together on that battlefield, father and son, the bond between them was absolute. For decades they fought side by side, not just in wars of conquest, but in councils of state, in decisions of immense consequence. Where the Emperor could not be seen, Horus would speak. Where the Imperium strained under rebellion or doubt, Horus was sent as the blade and the balm. His brilliance was unquestioned, his loyalty assumed. So when the time came to return to Terra, to retreat into the depths of the palace and begin the Webway project, the Emperor had only one real choice for command. He gave Horus the mantle of War Master, and with it, the burden of the Imperium. The Emperor did not make this decision lightly. He had foreseen possibilities, fractures in unity, rivalries among the primarchs. Guilliman with his order, Dorn with his unyielding fortresses, Russ with his feral honor. Any one of them might have served in Horus's place, but none would inspire love as Horus did. And so, upon the ashes of Ulanor, amid 1,000 cheering Astartes, the Emperor laid his hand upon Horus's shoulder and made his declaration. It was not just a promotion, it was a coronation. But the shadows came quickly. At first they were small, doubts whispered between brothers. A pause when Lorgar bowed just a little too long. A blink of tension in Mortarian's gaze. The resentment wasn't spoken aloud, not yet, but it twisted in the silences between their words. To them, Horus had not earned the title. He had been given it, and worse by a father who had then turned his back and walked away. The Emperor felt it happening, even from beneath the palace. He was not blind to his son's emotions, their genetic legacies, their flaws, their loyalties. Each of them bore part of his soul. And Horus? Horus had been forged closest to his ideal, passionate, charismatic, tactical, compassionate even. That humanity made him beloved. but it also made him vulnerable. As War Master, Horus had to project certainty, but privately, he wrestled with the weight of expectation. He wore the mantle well, conducting campaigns with ruthless brilliance, calming feuding legions, restoring crumbling systems. And yet, there were signs. A hesitation in his communiques to Terra, a longing in his voice when he spoke of their early crusades, an emptiness forming where his father's council once sat. In those early months, the Emperor remained silent, not because he was unaware, but because he could not afford distraction. The Webway project demanded total immersion. The Golden Throne required constant psychic maintenance. A fracture in focus could rupture the gate. Still, he watched. In the currents of the warp, he felt echoes of decisions made by his sons. Compliance missions turned brutal. Civilian worlds burned without strategic gain. Horus's shadow grew longer, and with it, the quiet influence of others. Erebus, Cor Pharaon. Whispers from the word-bearers began curling through the fleet, disguised as loyalty, cloaked in ritual. It was divinité influence that finally pulled the threads tight. When Horus was wounded on the moon of Devon, struck down by a corrupted blade during a false compliance, it was not the Emperor who was called. It was Erebus. It was the Serpent Lodge. It was the Warp. And it was there, on the brink of death, that Horus saw the vision. A future where the Emperor became a god, where humanity bowed, not out of faith, but out of fear, where the legions, his sons, were cast aside, betrayed, forgotten. It was a lie, a perfect lie, one shaped not just for a warrior, but for a wounded son. The Emperor felt the change before it was spoken. Not in words, not in reports, but in a psychic shiver that passed through the veil like oil across water. Horus had changed, not completely, not yet, but the warmth was gone. The fire remained, now cold, efficient, suspicious. His messages became less frequent, his orders more aggressive. When he finally received word of the massacre at Istvan III, the purging of loyalists from within the legions, the Emperor understood the truth. His son had turned, but by then it was too late to intervene. The Webway was under siege. The throne demanded his full power. If he left, even for a moment, the warp would flood Terra from beneath. The dream would die. Humanity would fall. And so he remained where he was, a god bound by necessity, watching the shadow of his most beloved creation devour the stars. Even then, part of him hoped that Horus might pull back, that the memory of their bond might survive the lies. But Horus had already surrounded himself with voices of corruption. The word-bearers flattered his pain. The Night Lords fed his cynicism. Fulgrim whispered of perfection, Mortarion of decay, Angron of rage, Curse of fate. Each legion became a reflection of its primarch's ruin, and Horus became their center. The War Master's shadow stretched across the galaxy. Where once there had been loyalty, now there was suspicion. Where once the Emperor had sent sons to enlighten, now they returned as executioners. In the warp, the gods of chaos laughed. The greatest of the primarchs had become their champion. And the Emperor, once proud, now silent, could only watch as the seeds of rebellion bloomed. It was not a mistake. It was a risk he had taken. A gamble born of urgency, necessity, and love. But Horus's fall was no longer theoretical. It was war, and the shadows no longer hid in corners. They marched beneath banners of rebellion. He had warned him. Magnus the Red, the Crimson King, the sorcerer of Prospero, had been told in no uncertain terms, "Do not meddle in the warp. Do not seek knowledge beyond the boundaries the Emperor had drawn. Do not open the gates between realities in search of forbidden truths." Magnus had listened, and then he had disobeyed. Not out of pride, not out of malice, but out of desperation. The warning he carried was too urgent, too terrible, too real to be silenced. He had seen it in the skeins of the warp, in the flickering ghosts of possible futures. Horus had turned. The War Master, once the exemplar of loyalty, now stood as the architect of betrayal. Magnus had watched it unfold, not through spies or reports, but through the all-seeing eye of sorcery. He saw legions turned against their brothers, worlds burning, the siege of Terra, the death of hope. And so Magnus did what he believed he must. He reached out to his father. The Emperor had not spoken to Magnus in many months. Their last encounter had been at the Council of Nicaea, where Magnus's views on the warp had been struck down before all his brothers, where the Emperor had, with calm finality, forbidden the practice of sorcery, not because Magnus was wrong, but because he was dangerously right. The warp could be read, yes, but it could not be trusted. It was a tide that seduced, then consumed. Magnus, ever the scholar, believed he was beyond such influence. The Emperor knew better. Still, despite his command, the Emperor left Magnus alive, left him on Prospero, surrounded by books and wards and sealed vaults, hoping that the lesson had taken root. But now, Magnus would break that silence. With all the psychic might of a being forged to channel the Imperium, he cast his soul into the warp, a desperate act of astral communication that defied everything his father had decreed. The spell was colossal, layered through multiple dimensions, burned through wards, across distance, through time. It pierced the veil of reality like a spear of red fire, and it reached Terra, it reached the Emperor, and it shattered everything. The psychic blast did not arrive as a whisper. It came like a hammer through stained glass. The Imperial Palace, already a fortress of uncountable protections, shook at its very foundation. Psychic alarms wailed. Custodians fell to their knees. Servitors burst into flame. Reality buckled. Magnus had not just made contact, he had breached the webway. Below the palace, the Emperor recoiled in fury. His work, years in the making, had been unmade in an instant. The dimensional lattice that held the webway portal stable cracked. The wards buckled, and in that fracture something else slipped through. Demons. The moment Magnus's mind touched his, the breach tore open, not just physically, but spiritually. The hidden gate beneath the throne became a wound. The Emperor felt the dark tide rushing in, felt it screaming, not with words but with hunger. He turned his full power upon the rift. The throne erupted in psychic fire. The project was lost, and then, above the roar of the warp, came Magnus's voice. "Father, he has betrayed you. Horus has fallen." The Emperor heard the message. He understood the urgency, but it was too late. The vision Magnus had seen of the War Master's corruption, the gathering of traitor legions, the brewing civil war, was not a fantasy. It was real. Horus had been wounded on Davin and returned changed. He now served the will of chaos, masked in the trappings of rebellion. And he would strike soon. Magnus had tried to prevent it, but his method had ensured it. His warning was a paradox, a truth delivered in the form of treason. The Emperor's fury was absolute. Not only had Magnus disobeyed his direct order, but his act had jeopardized the future of all mankind. The Webway project had been humanity's only hope of escaping chaos's influence. With the breach corrupted, demons now clawed at the very heart of Terra. For the first time in centuries, the Emperor was forced to react, not command. He had to seal the breach. He had to contain the war within the Webway. And he had to accept that the galaxy, once within his grasp, had begun to burn. But punishment could not wait long. Prospero had to answer, not just for defying the Emperor's will, but for compromising the integrity of Terra itself. He summoned Leman Russ, the Wolf King, the executioner. The command was simple: bring Magnus to Terra, in chains. Russ, ever loyal, departed with his fleet, but by the time he arrived in the Prospero system, another hand had moved. Horus. Already in rebellion, Horus intercepted the order and altered it. He whispered into Russ's ear that the Emperor's true wish was retribution, not capture, that Magnus had damned them all, that Prospero must burn. And so it did. The Emperor, still chained to the throne, could only watch from afar. The burning of Prospero was a horror he had hoped to avoid. Brother against brother, psychers against warriors, culture against savagery. Magnus did not fight back at first. He begged for understanding, for a chance to explain. But there was none. By the time the Thousand Sons turned to defend themselves, the wolves had already ripped through the city of Tisca, leveling its spires and shattering its libraries. The planet burned. Magnus, broken, betrayed, and in mourning, shattered himself upon the winds of the warp. He disappeared. The Emperor did not rejoice. There was no satisfaction in being right, only loss. Another son had been pushed to the edge, and now cast beyond it. In the aftermath, the Emperor turned his full attention back to the throne. The webway breach could not be allowed to widen. What had been a project of hope had become a war of attrition. Every moment not spent reinforcing the wards was a moment demons threatened to pour into the soul of Terra. But deep within the Emperor's mind, the echo of Magnus's warning remained. Horus, the War Master, the shadow on the stars, the heresy had begun. Not with a sword drawn, not with a shot fired, but with a whisper, a warning, one that cost the future more than anyone could yet understand. There is a sound to failure. It is not a roar, not a scream, not even the howling of the warp. It is a silence, impossible, suffocating just before everything breaks. Beneath the Imperial Palace, that silence came the moment Magnus tore through the veil. His astral form, flaring with the raw energies of the warp, collided with the Emperor's hidden project like a meteor crashing into glass. And in that instant, the web of power he had spent decades weaving shattered. The webway gate ruptured. Not in theory, not in abstraction. It broke. At first, it was psychic, a backlash of energy so intense that even the null aura of the Sisters of Silence couldn't mute it. Servitors exploded, custodians collapsed, the golden circuits beneath the throne cracked with a thunderclap that echoed across dimensions. Then came the rift. Not merely an opening, but a wound, a jagged, bleeding tear in the fabric of reality. What had once been a controlled corridor into the webway was now a gaping hole, unstable, screaming. And through it came the first horrors. Not ships, not soldiers, demons. The webway was not empty. Long before mankind, it had been carved by the Eldar, a labyrinth of impossible angles and hidden passages shielded from the eye of terror. But after their fall, cracks had formed. Some gates had collapsed. Others had been infiltrated. Warp entities, creatures of madness and hate, had slithered in through the cracks, lingering in forgotten corners, feeding on echoes of fear. The Emperor knew this. That's why he had anchored his gate beneath the palace. That's why he had constructed the throne to filter, to seal, to guard. But when Magnus broke through, he hadn't just alerted them. He had invited them. The first to emerge were minor entities, malformed, flickering shadows with too many eyes and limbs. They crept into the breach like rats through a cracked wall. But behind them came greater things, beasts of flame and laughter, mockeries of flesh, things that bore names once spoken by the Eldar in whispers. They poured into the Emperor's realm. The vaults beneath the throne became a war zone. The custodes responded instantly. Clad in auramite, wielding halberds of blazing plasma and blade, they formed a shield wall at the breach. They had trained for this, drilled for it, died for it. These were not mere bodyguards, they were demigods of war, handcrafted by the Emperor himself to stand between humanity and its doom. But even they were shaken. The demons did not fight as mortals did. They flowed like ink, shrieked with voices that cracked stone, bled hallucinations when cut. What was solid one moment became smoke the next. What died reformed moments later. The custodes held, but they could not stop the tide. The Sisters of Silence descended next. Their knoll fields washed over the breach like cold water on a fever. To demons they were poison, soulless, blank, incorruptible. Their very presence weakened the warp's hold. Where a sister walked, demons faltered, flickered, recoiled. But the warp adapts. It learns, it hates with creativity. And the rift was growing. At the heart of it all sat the Emperor. Upon the golden throne, still functional but now battered, he poured his will into the rift. Not words, not spells, force, pure impossible force. He held the breach shut not with machines, but with his own being. It became a daily siege, hour after hour, day after day, month after month. The Emperor did not sleep, could not leave. He became the gate, his mind a wall, his soul a fire. He fought not in the world of men, but in the lattice between dimensions. And still, the demons came, not through Terra itself, not yet, but into the web of tunnels he had carved within the webway. Those passages, once pure and full of potential, became haunted. Custodes patrols vanished. Chambers built as sanctuaries became charnel houses. The Emperor ordered countermeasures. The Legio Custodes war hosts descended in full. Golden warriors, silent and wrathful, began a campaign within the webway itself. A war unlike any fought in real space. No stars, no gravity, no time. Every battle was different. Some fought in what felt like seconds, others like years. Reality fractured in there, and in the heart of it the Emperor watched, held, endured. The dream was dying. The Webway project, once mankind's greatest hope, was now a battleground. No new gates could be built, no safe passage could be opened. The dimensional map he had once crafted so elegantly now resembled a wound chart. Red lines drawn through collapsed zones, corrupted nodes, lost sanctums. Entire sectors had to be sealed, others bombed into nothingness. Even Mars, once intended to be the first link in the Webway network, had to be cut off entirely. Yet the Emperor did not abandon it. He could not. The moment he stepped away from the throne, the breach would widen. The demons would find Terra. They would emerge from beneath the palace like blood from a corpse, and the world would fall before anyone realized it was dying. So he remained, chained not by shackles, but by responsibility. Outside, the galaxy burned, Istvan, Kalth, the fall of Monarchia. The legions divided, and within the Emperor sat upon the throne of fire and refused to fall. No messages came, no orders were given. He had to trust. Malkador, his regent, would coordinate the war from above. The Custodes would hold the Webway's corridors. The Astronomicon would continue to shine. Barely. But the dream he had built with such care, it was gone. The Webway was no longer a gift to mankind. It was a war that only he could fight. And every hour he remained sealed beneath the palace, Terra edged closer to siege. But he would not yield, not yet. Not while a single demon still clawed at the veil, not while a single soul remained uncorrupted. The Emperor would burn himself to ashes before he let his world fall, and as the throne groaned beneath his will, as his body began to strain from unending exertion, he knew this. This war beneath Terra was only the beginning. There are battles the galaxy records in chronicles, campaigns etched into banners, victories immortalized in songs. And then there are wars no one sees. Wars fought in darkness, wars in silence, wars behind the walls of reality itself. This was one of those. It did not begin with a declaration. It began with a leak, a drip of unreality into the veins of the Emperor's grand design. And then the flood came. The breach Magnus had torn in the webway, unintentionally but catastrophically, was no longer a hole in theory. It had become a gateway, open and festering, between the physical world and the worst corners of the Imperium. It was not a portal like those summoned by rogue sorcerers or warp cults. It was far worse. It was a permanent rent in reality, and from it came the flood. The first wave was subtle, whispering forms that moved between light and shadow, entities of sloth and despair, drifting like phantoms through the corridors of the nascent human webway. They did not scream, they did not claw, they simply were, and their presence was wrought. Machines malfunctioned, lights dimmed, servitors entered recursive loops, drooling incantations in languages they did not know. Custodes' patrols reported missing time, odd reflections, glimpses of things behind glass that were not there. The Emperor sensed it all. He sat atop the golden throne, his consciousness stretched like a mesh across the entire breach zone. What others felt as cold dread, he perceived as a rising tide, a deluge of unreality, seeping into every corridor, every chamber, every psychic thread he had laid. It had begun. Soon the deeper horrors followed. From within the warp-laced webway, the demons came not in legions, but in swarms, writhing masses of madness and hunger, shaped by belief and hate. Creatures of Nurgle, bloated and infectious, shuffled through the tunnels, leaving behind trails of contagion that devoured matter and soul. Entities of Slaanesh sang in tones that bent space, luring warriors to madness before they tore their own faces away in rapture. And then came the flames. Khorne's hounds, drooling rivers of molten brass, rampaged through the passages, slaughtering without strategy or pause. Bloodletters, screaming the same name in endless repetition, clashed with the custodes in duels that shattered the webway's structure itself. And threading through them all like spiders in a cosmic web were the Tzeentchian horrors, shifting, gleeful, speaking truths that never were, unraveling logic with each step. The human webway, once a pristine dream of interstellar transit, became a nightmare crucible. The Emperor's response was immediate and total. He did not command with words, there was no time. Instead, he exerted pressure, channeling his will through the Golden Throne into the structure of the webway itself. Where demons advanced, he made the walls collapse. Where screams rose, he sent pulses of unbeing, psychic shockwaves that tore immaterial flesh from impossible bones. But it was not enough. There were too many, too fast, too alive with the hate of the warp. The flood could not be stopped by force alone. The Adeptus Custodes, his elite, waged the counter-assault. They adapted quickly, their war forms reshaped for close-quarter fighting within dimensional flux. Each warrior was worth 100 Astartes, but for every victory, another passage collapsed behind them. Time moved inconsistently. Some patrols reported fighting for seconds, others for what felt like years. The Sisters of Silence, immune to the whispers, became frontline disruptors. Their mere presence tore psychic forms apart, but even they could not stem the tide completely. For every demon destroyed, 2 more formed from the psychic anguish of the webway's corruption. And still the Emperor remained. He never left the throne. He could not. Every moment away would open the breach further. Even now, the Golden Throne circuits were cracking under the strain. The psychic matrix was no longer just stabilizing a portal. It was acting as a dam, holding back an ocean of horror with the force of his soul alone. The Webway War was no longer a hidden skirmish. It had become a second front in the heresy, unseen, unspoken, but perhaps more important than any battlefield in the stars, because if Terra fell from within, It was over. The demonic flood, however, was not mindless. It began to adapt. The warp learns. It does not conquer like men do. It perverts. It mimics. It corrupts. Some of the entities began to wear faces, mocking faces. A primarch's voice echoed in one corridor, Magnus repeating, "I warned you," over and over. In another, a demon bloated with false divinity spoke with Horus's charisma, calling out to the custodes as brothers. It was psychological warfare on an existential scale, and the Emperor felt every word. For the first time in millennia, the Emperor began to strain, not falter, not weaken, but stretch. Holding the webway together was no longer a task of design and power. It became an act of personal endurance. The warp pushed against him not just with force, but with emotion, doubt, grief, regret. It tried to weaponize his memories, his failures, even his sons. And still he did not break. Instead, he fought harder. He rerouted the Golden Throne's functions, drawing energy from hidden reserves, sacrificial circuits long sealed. He burned through components never meant to be touched for centuries. He began consuming the psychic essences of volunteers. Thousands of psychers sacrificed daily, their souls funneled into the throne to feed its defenses. Their minds shattered in seconds, their bodies burned to ash, and the Emperor bore all of it. Because if he did not, Terra would fall before the first traitor legion even arrived. The flood never truly stopped. It became a siege, an eternal storm held at bay by one will, one throne, one man. And while the galaxy turned red with civil war, beneath the palace, the Emperor drowned in silence and refused to let go. There are many thrones in the galaxy, thrones of gold, of iron, of conquest and dominion, thrones claimed by emperors, warlords, and demagogues. But only one throne in human history has ever demanded not just rule, but sacrifice, ceaseless, unrelenting, final. The Golden Throne of Terra was not a symbol of power, it was a pyre. When the Emperor first sat upon it, the design had been elegant. It was never intended to be a prison. At the time, it was the centerpiece of a visionary marvel, the physical and psychic linchpin of mankind's passage through the webway, a psychic interface capable of sustaining multiple open gates across the stars, a means to link Terra, Mars, and eventually every sector of the Imperium through safe, warpless corridors. That dream had died. Now the throne was the dam wall, holding back the tide of madness that surged through the shattered gateway below. And the price of holding it was everything. The act of sealing the breach demanded more than strength. It required a mind vast enough to shape unreality, a soul immune to the corruption that poured through the warp, and a presence so absolute that even the demonic recoiled in instinctual terror. The Emperor met all three requirements, but even for him, it had consequences. The first was isolation. Since the throne had become active in its new purpose, the Emperor could not move. His form, ancient, ageless, genetically and psychically perfected, was bound to the mechanisms now in 1,000 subtle ways. Neural pathways, soul circuits, and psychic lattices connected him to the throne's matrix, like roots to a dying tree. He could no longer walk among his people, no longer speak with his sons, no longer intervene as Horus, Fulgrim, Angron, and the others turned their blades toward Terra. To move would mean to lose everything. The second sacrifice was time. It became elastic, meaningless. Days passed, then weeks, years. The Emperor's perception stretched between seconds and eternities. Locked in unending vigilance, he observed the breach like a god studying a battlefield made of light and shadow. He could no longer track the hours, but he remembered names. He remembered the psychers, the thousands of men and women brought before the throne each day. They were offered. They had no illusions. Their lives were consumed to keep the throne burning, their minds turned to fuel, their spirits shredded and redirected into the matrix of defense and stability. Every soul prolonged the Emperor's grip on the rift by minutes, maybe hours, and every single one of them screamed. He heard them all. He remembered every scream. He did not stop it. He could not afford mercy. But he never forgot their sacrifice. Their blood, their essence became the mortar that held the crumbling walls of reality in place. And as he burned them, he mourned them. That was the difference between a god and a monster. A monster forgets. The Emperor never did. The third sacrifice was self. The throne had begun to consume him as well. Not in body, not yet, but in spirit. Each day he sat upon it, a little more of his vast, magnificent will was siphoned into the task of maintaining the seal. The breach widened in complexity, even when its physical boundaries were contained. The warp is not linear. It pressed into the edges of thought. It tried to find cracks in the Emperor's mind, moments of regret, visions of past failures, weaknesses buried in memory. It showed him things, visions of a burning Prospero, of Vulcan screaming in chains, of Sanguinius weeping on a black stone floor, of Horus, younger, laughing in the glow of the Ulanor victory. The throne showed him these things not to inform, but to wound, and it worked. Bit by bit, the Emperor's vast mind was forced to wall off more of itself. Focus, narrow, sacrifice pieces of insight to retain focus. He was becoming less. It did not show on his face. Those who came before him, Malcador, Valdor, the High Lords, still saw the same impossible figure. Clad in radiant armor, crowned in thought, immobile but transcendent. The illusion of divinity remained intact. But the truth behind the gaze was not serenity. It was pain and resolve. The Emperor would not allow himself to fracture, not while Terra stood, not while mankind had a future, not while his sons still lived. At times he heard them, not in voice, but in the echoes left behind. He knew Dawn was preparing the defenses, that Guilliman's Ultramar had been cut off, that Sanguinius still rallied the Blood Angels, and that Corax had vanished into shadow. He knew of the Alpha Legion's duplicity, of Mortarian's descent. He could feel the rise of warp storms, the gathering tension of the traitor legions. But he could not act, only endure. And in that endurance, the final cost began to show. The throne, never designed for this purpose, was failing. Cracks in its physical structure were patched with golden banding and techno-arcane grafts. Entire sections of the machinery had to be replaced mid-operation, often while the Emperor remained fused within it. The Mechanicum, guided by Malcador and the Silent Order, provided everything they could. But the technology was dying. The Emperor was fighting a slow death not just of the webway, but of the throne itself. And the only solution was to continue feeding it. Feeding it psychers, souls, himself. He was no longer the Emperor of parades and proclamations. He was now the linchpin of human survival. The last firewall between the Materium and the infinite hunger of chaos. And he knew this, the day he failed to sit on the throne, would be the day mankind fell. The golden throne of Terra was never meant to be a tomb, but every hour he sat upon it, it became more of one. Not by design, by necessity. He had sacrificed the galaxy, his sons, his body, and his future, to buy humanity a few more days of light. He could no longer stand beside them, but they stood for him. In a galaxy buckling under the weight of betrayal, where brother turned blade on brother and worlds burned in endless rebellion, there were still those who did not falter. Warriors who had never knelt before the gods of chaos, who had never doubted, who had never needed belief because their very existence was forged from absolute loyalty. They did not bear banners. They did not crave glory. They did not even speak his name. They were the custodians, and they were the last wall between mankind and oblivion. The Adeptus Custodes were not Astartes. They were not mass-produced, legion-spanning instruments of conquest. They were singular, unique, each a work of biomantic art, forged by the Emperor's own hand in the early days of Terra's unification. Where a space marine was powerful, a custodian was perfected. And where the legions looked to their primarchs as fathers, the custodes had no one but him. They were his shadow, his will given form. And now they were all that stood beside him as the throne began to devour his strength. When the breach in the webway had first opened, the custodes had been the first to descend, not as defenders, but as hunters. Their purpose was singular: contain the demonic infestation before it could ever rise from the hidden vaults of the Imperial dungeon. That dungeon, buried beneath the Imperial Palace, was never merely a prison or an archive. It was the cradle of the webway gate, and it had now become the front line in a war no citizen of Terra could ever be allowed to know existed. And so the 10,000 descended in silence, clad in auramite, wielding halberds that could split time as well as flesh. They waged a war few could understand. It was not one of conquest. There were no objectives, no territory, no victories, only containment. The demons, unending, shifting, alien in shape and purpose, poured through the fault lines Magnus had torn open. They changed with every encounter. One moment they were beasts of claw and fire. The next, they were mockeries of imperial saints, whispering blasphemies in perfect high Gothic. The Custodes did not flinch. They answered with steel. Among them were legends. Raw Endymion, who slew a dozen warp entities on the threshold of the throne room. Aemon, master of the Watch, who stood as both blade and scholar, keeper of the Emperor's forgotten decrees. Diocletian Koros, the voice of the Dawn Eaters, whose vigil lasted 4 unbroken months of battle across collapsing dimensions within the webway. These warriors were not just soldiers, they were memory, they were judgment. They were his presence when the Emperor could not act. Yet they were not alone. Another presence stalked the darkened vaults and echoing silence. Not golden, not radiant, but just as important. The Sisters of Silence, soulless, psychically dead. To demons they were agony incarnate. Where a Psyker opened windows to the warp, a sister slammed them shut. Entire swarms of lesser demons evaporated in their null auras. Greater ones recoiled, their forms unraveling at the edges, unable to maintain cohesion in the dead air around them. They did not speak, not because they could not, but because they chose not to. Their silence was not absence, it was a weapon. Together, the custodians and the sisters formed the Emperor's last circle. They patrolled the corridors of the dungeon and the webway beyond in teams. Golden gods and pale phantoms, side by side, hunting horrors that had never known fear, until now. Every patrol was a sacrifice. Time functioned differently inside the webway. A 30-minute engagement might result in a custodian returning after a subjective year of fighting. Entire strike teams vanished into temporal loops. Others returned without faces, their armor charred, unable to describe what they had seen without fracturing mentally. They endured it willingly, because he was still watching. They did not receive orders from the throne. The Emperor could no longer command in voice or gesture. Instead, they operated by his will. Subtle pulses of intention felt through the psychic lattice that bound the throne to its defenders. Sometimes it came as a burst of pressure in the mind, sometimes a sudden understanding of where to go, what route to seal, what horror to slay before it fully formed. It was not communication, it was symbiosis. They were his hands now. Above ground, the rest of Terra braced for war. The traitor fleets had not yet arrived, but the High Lords, the Imperial Fists, and the Mechanicum knew what was coming. Still, few realized that the greatest war was already being fought beneath them. Every moment, every heartbeat, every breath of the Emperor's effort holding back a tide none of them could comprehend. Only the custodians and sisters knew the truth, and they never spoke it, not even to each other. There were moments when the custodes faltered, moments when the war in the webway turned too surreal, too impossible, and even they questioned the limits of duty. Some encountered illusions of their own deaths, or worse, visions where they failed to protect the Emperor. A subtle twist of warp thought designed to tempt hesitation. The ruin of even a single moment of discipline could be fatal, but they stood every single time. Because they were not just warriors. They were the guardians of mankind. When one of them fell, there were no eulogies. His name was etched in no public record. Instead, the Emperor felt the death, not as a name, but as a flicker of extinguished light in the vast net of golden mines. And though he could not move, he remembered. Each custodian who died in the webway did not die alone. Their deaths were witnessed by the only god mankind had ever known, and their sacrifice burned into the walls of the throne room, invisible to all but him. So the war beneath Terra continued, in halls warped by impossible geometry, in tunnels that bled, in vaults that echoed with cries never spoken aloud, and through it all the Guardians walked in silence, blades at the ready, watching, waiting, never blinking, because he needed them, and they had never once failed him. Light. In the darkness of a galaxy devoured by war, light had become something more than survival. It was direction. It was structure. It was hope. And nowhere in the Imperium did that light burn brighter or cost more than at the heart of Terra. It was not a flame. It was not even a star. It was a psychic beacon cast from the mind of the Emperor himself, the Astronomicon. Across thousands of light years, ships in the void sailed by its signal. Navigators, whose third eyes were blind to the visible spectrum but attuned to the warp, could fix themselves on it like birds to magnetic north. Through storms, past unseen horrors, the Astronomicon allowed fleets to move, reinforcements to arrive, and entire sectors to function. Without it, the Imperium would collapse into fragmented empires, blind and dying in the void. But like everything built on the Emperor's back, the Astronomicon came with a cost, and during the Heresy, the price rose daily. The Astronomicon had not always existed. In the early centuries of the Great Crusade, warp travel had been slower, more perilous. Ships ventured between stars with courage, yes, but also with guesswork and prayer. It wasn't until the Emperor stabilized Terra that he turned his full attention to psychic infrastructure, and the Astronomicon was born. Not merely a projection of will, it was a lighthouse made of souls. Thousands of psychers, thousands, were sacrificed to feed it. Each day their minds were drained of thought and spark, their essence funneled into the mechanism that channeled the Emperor's psychic light across the stars. They were called the Choir, and they sang in silence, for the Emperor, for mankind. During the Heresy, the choir grew louder because the storms were coming. The warp, always treacherous, had begun to roil with violence and corruption. Massive warp storms, not seen since the Age of Strife, surged across the galaxy as chaos moved in force. Where once the Astronomicon's light reached 1,000 sectors, now it was dimmed, disrupted, scattered. Entire regions went dark, the segmentum obscurus, the edges of Ultima, the fringes of segmentum tempestus. Fleets vanished, astropaths went mad, even navigators supposedly immune to mere mortal fears began to question whether the beacon could endure. The Emperor felt it all. He did not project the Astronomicon like a torch held high. He became it, even as he sat on the throne battling the breach in the webway, his mind stretched across the void, layered in impossible networks of focus and light. It was not one act of consciousness, but a splitting of self. One mind for the webway, one mind for the throne's machinery, one mind for the beacon. To maintain it, he sacrificed even more psychers. Where once hundreds were needed per day, now thousands perished in a ceaseless rhythm of extinction. They were fed into the throne, chosen from across the Imperium, loaded onto black ships, drugged into silence and burned in the fires of a god's necessity. None of them were remembered by name, but the Emperor knew them, not personally, not emotionally, but as extensions of his work, pillars holding up the bridge over chaos. To the High Lords, the Astronomicon was logistics. To the navigator houses, it was navigation. But to the Emperor, it was everything. Without it, no reinforcements could reach Terra, no loyal worlds could remain connected. Guilliman in Ultramar would become an island. Dawn would lose touch with the edges of the Segmentum Solar. The Blood Angels, the White Scars, even the Shattered Legions who still resisted, all would drift, isolated and vulnerable. And Horus, he would exploit that silence. The War Master understood the Astronomicon's value. While the traitor legions had access to warpcraft and demonic corridors, Horus still recognized the beacon as the Imperium's nerve center. If he could sever it, or better yet, poison it, Terra's defenses would crumble. There are whispers in the Black Books, recorded by the Sigillites' scribes, of agents dispatched to sabotage the Astronomicon's network. Warp-twisted cults infiltrating the Mechanicum's sublabs, psychic saboteurs disguised as offering volunteers. Some even tried to corrupt the choir mid-broadcast, causing howling disruptions that echoed for days. Each time the Emperor countered it, not with fists, not with armies, but with concentration. He smoothed the ripples, redirected the energy, overwhelmed the infection with sheer force of will. The beacon never blinked, even as Terra burned, even as demons raged beneath the palace, even as the galaxy howled, the Emperor's light held. But every act of endurance took its toll. His psychic self began to show strain. The choir, sensing his fatigue, began to burn out faster. Even the most powerful psychers began to collapse minutes into contact with the throne's conduits. Some boiled from the inside, others screamed prophecies of doom, collapsing in a heap of words and blood. Malcador, his most trusted servant, was forced to begin drawing more widely. Prisoners, outcast mutants, astropathic adepts who had never trained for such a purpose. Their minds fed the Astronomicon like driftwood into a furnace. And yet, the beacon endured. From orbit, ships could still see it, a pinprick of white in the psychic murk of the warp, a pulse, a path. To navigators aboard warships, it was a divine song, a harmony they could hear only in dreams, a compass they could feel in their soul. To traitors, it was a wound they could not close. At the center of it all, the eye, the source, the will, sat the Emperor of mankind, his face impassive, his form unmoving, his mind split 1,000 ways, holding back demons, holding the webway closed and shining. Light is not a weapon, but it makes weapons possible. Without the Astronomicon, Dawn could not have fortified the palace. The loyalist legions could not have rallied. The siege of Terra could not have been answered. This was the Emperor's quietest battle, and it may have been his most important. Beneath the foundations of the Imperial Palace, below the dungeons, the hidden chambers, even the vaults of the Sigillite, there exists a place no map dares mark. A sealed sanctum entombed in psycho-reactive stone, void-shielded, null-warded, and stitched against time itself. Its name is lost to all but 3 minds in the Imperium. the Emperor, Malkador, and the silent artificer known only as the Architect of the Vaults, long erased from memory, yet eternally present in the mechanisms he helped seal. This place is where the Talisman of Seven Hammers was forged. The talisman was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It had no blade, no gun, no energy discharge. But it was built to end wars, to erase entire strands of reality, to bring about an absolute void where even the warp itself would be torn asunder. It was the Emperor's contingency. Even before the heresy, the Emperor had known that creation comes with risk, that the primarchs, magnificent and terrible, might one day fall prey to forces even he could not fully control. He had seen what lurked in the Imperium. He had seen what could become of power untethered from reason. And so, in the shadows of the Great Crusade, he began construction on the talisman, not out of vengeance, but out of preparation. Its crafting required impossible materials, psycho-reactive adamantium mined from the cursed crust of Saturn's inner moons, null lattice filaments woven from the bone marrow of genetically engineered blanks, grown in silence by the Sisters of Silence in secluded labs, chrono-distorted alloys stolen from deep Ordo Chronos experiments, metals that had no fixed time, bound simultaneously to what was and what could never be. And to bind it all together, a single thought inscribed not in ink but in soul stuff, an emperor's word, a command that could not be spoken, only remembered. The construction was sacred. It took place over 7 nights in a room lit by no flame, where no sound could echo. 7 custodians, chosen from among the 10,000, took up 7 ritual hammers. These were no ordinary tools, each one forged in spiritual alignment to a fundamental truth of reality. Each blow they struck severed a psychic thread between Terra and the Imperium. Every strike echoed through the warp itself. With each hammerfall, the web of fate around the talisman unraveled, until, at last, it existed outside the realm of prophecy. And when it was complete, there was nothing. Not silence, not stillness, nothing. The talisman doesn't pulse, doesn't glow, it absorbs. Its presence is like a hole in the air, a psychic blind spot. To most, it is simply not there, but to those who do perceive it, the sensation is one of vertigo, of having forgotten something fundamental, something vital, something they never should have seen. Because the talisman is finality given form, the Emperor did not want to use it. He stored it away in the deepest vault, locked behind 7 seals, encoded with psychic failsafes that only he and Malkador could access. But he kept it ready, because he understood the warp. He understood the depth of chaos, and he understood that if Terra fell, if the webway broke open and demons poured into the Imperium, if the throne itself collapsed, then there could be no salvation, only denial. The purpose of the talisman was not to save the Imperium, it was to deny it to the gods, to collapse the interface between the warp and the Imperium over a wide region, to smother demonic energy, to render sorcery inert, to blind psychers, silence whispers, shatter prophecy. In that radius there would be no chaos, but also no light, no astronomicon, no warp travel, no psychic communication. A terrible price, but better than the alternative. Malkador opposed it at first. He argued that such a device was madness, that it represented not strategy, but surrender, that it was an act of unmaking, unbecoming of an emperor who had always built forward. But the Emperor did not flinch. "If I cannot win," he once said to Malkador in private, "then I will deny them the right to claim my species." Malkador, as ever, obeyed, and so the talisman remained sealed, a black sun waiting for its moment. No one speaks of it now. Most do not even know it exists. The High Lords have no access. The custodians who forged it were sworn to silence, and those who broke the seals to maintain its housing were mind-wiped after. Even among the Ordo Malleus and the Inquisition, it is legend, a myth of the throne's last option. But the Emperor remembers it, as the heresy reached Terra, as Horus prepared his final march, as the walls of reality groaned beneath demonic siege. He did not forget the hammer beneath the palace. He hoped never to lift it, but if he did, he would not hesitate. The warp does not cast shadows in the conventional sense. It has no sun, no fire, no light to be blocked or absorbed. But even without shape or form, darkness grows in its tides. Not the absence of illumination, but the swelling presence of something worse: malice. By the midpoint of the Horus Heresy, the Emperor no longer observed the galaxy through the lens of the stars. His reach into the Imperium had shrunk to flickers, but in the warp, his awareness stretched endlessly, and he saw it. The shadow was coming. The warp had always been restless, a mirror of mortal consciousness, a reflection of all that mankind feared, hoped, or hated. But as the heresy spread and more worlds turned traitor, the mirror fractured. Rage did not simply echo in the Imperium. It took form. Entire regions of the galaxy were swallowed by warp storms. They were not natural phenomena. They were reactions, eruptions, driven by emotion, magnified into godhood. As Horus marched from world to world, claiming planets with fire and seduction, the warp behind him screamed. The Emperor felt each cry. He felt it not in sound but in pressure. Weight. The kind of pressure that turns stars inward and makes thoughts bleed. It pressed against the walls of the Golden Throne like a tide against a dam. And unlike before, it had intent. The shadow had names. Or perhaps masks. Khorne, rising on the blood spilled by brother against brother. Nurgle, thriving in the despair of ruined worlds and forgotten soldiers. Tzientch, coiling through plots, lies, and double betrayals. And Slaanesh, newly born in the warp's velvet folds, whispered through Fulgrim's twisted soul. These were not abstract forces now. They were entities, self-aware, malevolent, evolving faster with every atrocity committed in their name. The warp had ceased to be a tide. It had become a current, and it was flowing toward Terra. Even confined to the throne, the Emperor could feel how the shadows had changed. They did not merely creep. They reached. They clawed at the cracks Magnus had opened. They probed the defenses Malcador built. They whispered at the edges of custodian minds. Some shadows even began to speak back, twisting the thoughts of astropaths, infecting dreams with images of falling angels and burning thrones. The Astronomicon still burned, for now, but its light did not push the shadow back anymore. It only made the shape of the shadow clearer. From the depths of the warp, echoes of false laughter rippled, mocking, predatory. In that darkness, the Emperor saw the aftershocks of betrayal long before they reached Terra. He saw the wolf of Fenris howling at the stars as his legion tore itself apart in isolation. He saw the Crimson Path laid bare, Angron's bloody wake ripping a corridor through the warp that left nothing untouched. He saw Lorgar's dark pilgrimage, the word-bearers vanishing into the eye of terror, only to re-emerge clad in ruin and scripture written in burning tongues. And he saw Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, building fortresses within fortresses, not to defend, but to ensnare. Each of these events left bruises on the warp. The shadow twisted around them, feeding on purpose. The Emperor did not flinch, but within the confines of his psychic fortress, he tightened his will. What had once been an open hand across the stars, reaching, guiding, lifting, had now become a clenched fist. There were places he could no longer see. Cadia, Kalth, Istvan V. The warp choked the pathways, not merely through violence, but through obfuscation, like fog that remembers where you've been and refuses to let you leave. His perception could not penetrate without cost. Every attempt to extend his awareness across those sectors was met with backlash. Demonic visions, psychic static, and infinite mirrors showing the same lies in endless variations. Even the most powerful psychers in the Imperial Palace could no longer interpret the signals. Malkador warned that the very nature of the warp was changing, becoming not just a realm of reflection, but of deception. This too was part of the shadow. Not a brute force, but a creeping infection. A war of doubt. The Emperor understood this war intimately. After all, it had started with trust. Trust in Horus, trust in Magnus, trust in his sons. Now, every echo in the warp whispered regret. The shadow played them back to him. You left them. You trusted too much. You were never their father, only their architect. Your sons do not love you. They fear you, and fear breeds rebellion. The Emperor did not answer. He could not waste strength on voices. But he remembered. He remembered Ulanor. He remembered placing the laurel upon Horus's brow. He remembered believing that greatness could be shared. The shadow, ever watching, fed on those memories. Not because they were weak, but because they were true. As the siege of Terra approached, the shadow in the warp thickened into something tangible. The skies above the Sol system flickered. The Astronomicon pulsed unnaturally. Entire regions of space-time groaned under the weight of incoming fleets and unseen watchers. The Emperor knew what was coming. He had seen it in every ripple. The War Master would come, not just with Astartes and Titans, but with the eye of the gods behind him, with the full weight of the warp's shadow at his back. And when Horus arrived, it would not be Horus alone. It would be a conduit, a vessel of hatred, of betrayal, of every twisted thing the Emperor had tried to erase from mankind's genome. Not just rebellion, but the justification of it. The warp had not corrupted Horus in one moment. It had studied him, mirrored him, fed him truths he never voiced and dreams he feared to share. And the shadow had made him believe they were his own. The Emperor could not rise, he could not intervene. All he could do was witness, and in witnessing, ensure that he remembered. Because that is the nature of light. Not to banish all darkness, but to reveal what it hides. There are days when stars die, and no one notices. There are hours when empires fall, and history forgets them. But there are also moments so singular, so impossibly vast in implication, that reality itself holds its breath. This was one of those moments. The Emperor of mankind, master of 1,000,000 worlds, creator of the primarchs, architect of the Imperium, stepped away from the golden throne. For the first time in decades, he stood unshackled. None witnessed the exact instant he rose. There was no audience, no fanfare, no proclamation. Only the Sigillite saw it, and even Malkador, the man who had served as his voice, his right hand, his shadow, could scarcely comprehend it. The Emperor did not simply stand. He unfolded. Reality bent slightly as he moved. Time stuttered. Thought slowed. Light dimmed, not from absence, but reverence. The Emperor had been still for so long, for reasons that few could understand. His absence had not been retreat, nor failure, but an act of pure endurance, maintaining the integrity of the webway gate beneath Terra, shielding mankind from a demonic flood that would have undone the galaxy in days. But now the seal was ready to be passed, and the moment had come for him to walk once more. The walls of the throne room had witnessed untold horrors in recent years. Webway demons had bled through the cracks of space, fought off only by the unyielding custodes and the Sisters of Silence, with psychic blood smearing time itself across the chamber's scorched foundations. Now, in the silence, that same room seemed to exhale as the Emperor stepped down. Malkador knelt, not as a subject, but as a man who knew what would come next. The Emperor laid a hand on his shoulder, the gesture not of a god to a servant, but of one soul acknowledging the cost soon to be paid by another. "You know what must be done," he said quietly. "I am ready," Malkador whispered. What the Emperor passed to Malkador in that moment was not simply control of the throne. It was burden in its most absolute form. To hold the webway gate closed was to anchor one's soul against a never-ending psychic storm, a flood of demonic energy that clawed at the edges of existence. It would burn Malkador from the inside out. It would unravel him thought by thought until only ashes remained. He knew this, and yet he accepted. Because Terra had to be saved. The Emperor walked beyond the throne, and the palace changed. At first, it was only noticed by those closest to the core, sudden silence in the warp, an unbearable stillness like the air before a thunderclap. Then came the pressure, a dense psychic weight spreading outward like a nova, not hostile, not painful, but overwhelming in its purity. Servitors seized. Vox arrays flickered, navigators fainted, null shields buzzed and overloaded. Word began to spread among the defenders. "He is coming." Astartes across the walls fell into stunned silence. Veterans of 1,000 campaigns trembled. Custodians, born and raised to serve his will, dropped to one knee without hesitation or command. They had felt his presence in dreams, in war, in the heat of combat. Now, for the first time in years, they felt him awake. He did not wear armor. He wore light and will. His aura was not golden, and it was absolute. A denial of weakness, a banishment of doubt. Every step he took was a rebuke to chaos, to the lies whispered in the minds of his fallen sons. The demons that still prowled the outer wards of the palace recoiled from his approach. Not just in fear, but in agony, in disgust, in recognition. They knew what walked toward them, and what it would mean. Rogol Dorn met him first, deep in the tertiary strategium of the Sanctum Imperialis. He said nothing. The primarch of the 7th Legion, builder of walls, stood tall, but there was sorrow in his eyes. He knew, as all the loyal sons did, that this moment marked the final turning. What came next would leave none of them untouched. The Emperor looked at him. A shared memory passed between them, unspoken. The great design, the crusade, the dream. Then he walked on. Sanguinius waited beside the Eternity Gate. His wings were torn. Blood slicked his armor. He had barely slept in weeks. The angel bore the weight of prophecy, though he had never asked for it. He bowed his head. The Emperor placed a hand over his heart. This son of all, he would trust to go with him. They both knew what it meant. Beyond the gate, terror burned. The outer walls had been breached. Mechanized traitor regiments advanced like insects across the corpse-littered soil. The Legio Mortis had shattered mountains with their god engines. Demons slipped through cracks in reality and stalked the battlefields in skinless laughter. And above it all, in orbit, floated the vengeful spirit. Horus's flagship, the Eye of the Heresy. The War Master had revealed himself. He had thrown open his vessel's veil, inviting his father to come. He knew the Emperor could not resist. He had made it personal. The teleportation matrix was prepared. Only a small contingent would go. The Emperor, Sanguinius, a hand-picked few. The loyalist primarchs had insisted on sending more, but he refused. Too many would draw the attention of the warp's entities. Too many variables. This duel would be clean. It had to be. Malkador, now seated upon the throne, felt the full weight settle upon him. Sweat streamed down his brow. His hands clawed at the arms of the throne. Already the gate was screaming at the edges of his mind. But he held. He would hold until his final breath. The Emperor turned to those who would follow him. No speech was given, no battle cry. That was never his way. His presence was enough. His meaning was clear. Then he gave the command. The teleportation field activated, and they vanished in a spear of light. The siege continued, but in the warp something paused. Something great and ancient turned its gaze toward the vengeful spirit and shivered. The final act had begun. Of all the names etched into the Imperium's legacy, few are spoken with such reverent fear or such deliberate silence as Malcador the Sigillite. Most know him only as the Emperor's right hand, the first Grand Master of the Administratum, the founder of the Inquisition. But that tells nothing of who he truly was. Malcador was not a warrior. He did not stride the stars with a bolter. He did not command legions. He held no blade forged on Mars. But make no mistake, he was a weapon of memory, of judgment, and of unbreakable will. He had stood at the Emperor's side since the earliest days of Old Earth, long before the Unification Wars carved terror into the forge of empire. When the world was fractured and crawling with techno-barbarian warlords, Malcador walked alone through ruins and smoke to find him. Some whisper that he was not born, but created, that he was engineered in the same vein as the primarchs, not for war, but for wisdom. Others believe he was simply the last of a rare kind of human, a powerful psyker whose mind did not burn under its own weight. Whatever the truth, Malcador understood the Emperor not as a god, but as a man with a burden greater than history could bear. And so he served him, not as a servant, but as a witness. During the Great Crusade, Malcador was everywhere and nowhere. He drafted laws, coordinated exploration fleets, established the Council of Terra, and laid the foundation for what would become the Adeptus Administratum. It was Malcador who built the Imperium's spine, the hidden web of diplomacy, compliance, bureaucracy, and order. He was the Emperor's silence between words, the space where no blade could reach, but from which wars could be won. But it was during the Heresy, and most of all in its final hours, that Malcador truly stepped into legend. When the War Master's rebellion ignited, Malcador did not panic. He planned. He knew the galaxy would burn, and he knew it must survive anyway. He did not hesitate to draft new orders for the Officio Assassinorum. He oversaw the reorganization of Terran defense grids. He secretly gathered psychers, scholars, and mystics, knowing the warp would soon consume all communication. He held together the crumbling scaffolding of empire with little more than parchment and unyielding will. And when the Emperor confined himself to the Golden Throne to hold the webway gate shut, it was Malcador who carried the Imperium on his shoulders. He knew it could not last. He had seen the end coming long before any Primarch did, and he was prepared to pay the price. By the time the Siege of Terra began, Malcador was already a shadow of himself. He had not slept in months. He barely ate. His psychic aura was thin and strained, not because it was fading, but because he had used it as a furnace, burning his life down to keep the Emperor's work alive. When the time came, when the Emperor finally rose from the throne, Malcador was waiting. He did not weep. He did not beg. He merely bowed his head and asked, "Is it time?" The Emperor did not answer. He only placed a hand on Malcador's shoulder. And that was enough. To sit upon the Golden Throne was not to sit upon a chair. It was to become a gate, a vessel through which the psychic weight of the webway would flow. Even the Emperor, the most powerful psyker in the galaxy's history, had been forced to remain upon it for decades. And even then he had not stopped the incursion, only slowed it. For Malcador to take his place, even for a moment, was to walk into annihilation. He understood this, and still he climbed the steps without faltering. As the Emperor descended to face Horus aboard the vengeful spirit, Malcador took his place upon the throne. The pain began instantly, not physical but existential. His soul was no longer confined to his body. It stretched, tore, expanded like fabric soaked in fire. He felt the edges of the webway tearing at his consciousness, demons howling, screaming his name, clawing to get through. He held them back, not with power, but with refusal. Because that was Malcador's gift. Not great force, not godlike psychic strength, but the refusal to fail. He was not born to ascend. He was born to stand. For those who witnessed it from the walls of the inner sanctum, it was like watching a man evaporate in slow motion. Skin peeled, bone cracked, blood turned to ash. But still, Malcador held, for minutes, then for an hour, then longer. It should have been impossible. By all measures, Malcador should have died within moments. But he endured, and endured, and endured, because he had always known it would come to this. He had never been a primarch, he had never led armies, but he had prepared the Emperor's plans for after, for the reformation of the Imperium, for the founding of the Inquisition, for the Librarius and the Black Ships, for the trial of chaos itself. If the Emperor won, Malcador would ensure mankind did not forget why. But time bends in the warp, and what felt like hours may have been minutes or days. Eventually, even Malcador could hold no longer. His essence began to burn. The golden throne flickered, warp energies surged, reality buckled. But just before his soul could be torn free, just before the webway screamed open again, the Emperor returned. And he found his friend broken, drained, collapsed in a heap of smoldering robes and bone. Malcador was not dead, but he was no longer truly human. The Emperor lifted him in silence. No words were spoken, no gratitude offered. There was no need. Everything between them had already been said, in trust, in sacrifice, in duty. Malcador the Sigillite did not die that day, but he was ended. His mind, once so sharp, so vast, so full of human brilliance, was reduced to embers. He had given everything, not for glory, not for legacy, but because the Emperor had asked, and that was enough. Today his name is carved into the foundations of the Imperial Palace, not above the throne nor beside the primarchs, but beneath the Hall of Memory, alone, silent, eternal, where only the Emperor can hear it spoken. The vengeful spirit hung in the void above Terra like a specter of doom. A ship once majestic, now disfigured beyond reason. The flagship of the Lunar Wolves had become a floating wound in real space, corrupted by warp energies, fed by betrayal, and crowned by the will of Horus Lupercal, now fully possessed by chaos. The Emperor gazed upon it, and for the first time in decades, he allowed himself a moment of reflection. Not regret, not sorrow, just memory. The vengeful spirit had once carried hope, the spearhead of the Great Crusade, the shining banner of mankind's advance into the stars. Now it was a monument to failure, and he would burn it from existence. The teleportation chamber beneath the Imperial Palace thrummed with impossible energies. The Emperor stood at its center, surrounded by his chosen few. Sanguinius, angelic and weary, still bore the wounds of the siege, yet his eyes burned with clarity. He understood what was coming. A handful of custodians, elite even among their kind, made final preparations. Each knew this was not a mission of survival, but of fulfillment. They would walk into hell itself, and likely not walk back out. The Emperor looked to them all. No speech was needed, no ritual, no prayer. They knew, and that was enough. The order was given, reality bent, the warp screamed, and in a flash of golden light, they vanished from the throne world. They materialized not into a corridor, but into chaos incarnate. The vengeful spirit no longer obeyed the laws of logic. Its internal geometry had been twisted by demonic infestation. Corridors looped back into themselves, walls bled, gravity reversed, voices echoed from behind doors that no longer existed. The ship was alive, and it hated them. The Emperor stepped forward first, his psychic aura ignited in response to the ship's malevolence. A wave of light pulsed outward from him, vaporizing lesser demons and silencing the warp's screeching laughter. But the resistance was immediate. Flayed servitors fused with demonettes launched themselves from the ceilings. Bolts of warp fire tore through the air. The air itself seemed to resist their movement, thick, charged with malice. The custodians formed a protective phalanx around the Emperor. Sanguinius moved like a blade of light, striking with such speed that reality struggled to track his position. The Emperor advanced. Every step he took burned away corruption, but it also provoked the ship further. This was not a vessel anymore. It was a fortress of madness, and they had only begun to breach its walls. The corridors led them through what had once been the Strategium. The hololithic displays were now shrines, covered in flayed skin, etched with forbidden runes. The air reeked of ozone and blood. Demon princes screamed sermons in languages not meant for human throats. The Emperor did not speak. He simply raised a hand, and with it, unleashed a wave of force so potent it shattered bone, soul, and shadow alike. The enemies of mankind fell one by one, but still they came. Hours passed, or minutes, or years. Time bled within the vengeful spirit. Memories surged and twisted. Visions of dead primarchs danced at the edge of perception. Leman Russ laughing in shadow, Guillimain weeping, Vulcan burning. None were real, none were illusion. They were projections, the ship itself digging into the psyches of its intruders, trying to weaken resolve. But the Emperor's mind was beyond corruption. And Sanguinius? He endured, even as the ship whispered his fate to him, even as it showed him the duel to come, his death at Horus's hands. He moved forward, because he had to, because the Emperor needed him. They passed through chambers that defied understanding, an arena of screaming skulls, a cathedral made entirely of bone, a hangar where corrupted thunderhawks roared in loops through non-Euclidean space. Each step was a battle, each breath a test of will. By the time they reached the outer threshold of the bridge, 3 custodians had fallen. One had been ripped into the warp by a portal that should not have existed. Another melted from the inside out after deflecting a curse meant for the Emperor. None hesitated, because this was the end. The bridge doors were alive, literally. Constructed now of fused corpses and demonic sinew, they pulsed with a heartbeat not heard, but felt. Black ichor dripped from above, sizzling on the floor. The Emperor stepped forward and placed his palm against it. The ship shrieked. The door died, and it opened. Inside was darkness, not absence of light, but presence of truth. The truth of corruption, the truth of betrayal, and at the heart of it stood Horus, or what had once been Horus. The being that now faced them bore only a faint resemblance to the War Master. His face had been reshaped into a cruel mask of glory. His armor writhed with demonic faces. His voice echoed with the chorus of 4 gods. And yet, somewhere beneath it all, deep within the swirling mass of power, was the echo of a son. The Emperor stepped forward, and Horus spoke. "Father," he said, voice layered with mockery and venom. "You came." The words were simple, but they carried 1,000 lifetimes of accusation. "You abandoned us. You used us. You made us to fail. You made me to fall." The Emperor did not answer. He looked not at the monster before him, but at what was left behind its eyes. A flicker of Horus, a memory of Ulanor, a moment before all was lost. Then he raised his hand. The duel did not begin with words. It began with truth. Psychic fire collided with demonic strength. Warp and will tore through each other. The bridge shook, space fractured, the walls split open, revealing the void, and beyond it, Terra, watching, waiting. But that is the next chapter. This was the clash before the end, the assault on madness, the wounding of hope, the march into damnation. The Emperor had descended, and now above the burning throne world, he would fight to end the war, with his son's soul in one hand and judgment in the other. The battle for Terra had become a scream in slow motion, firestorms across continents, titans locked in duels that cracked the bedrock of continents, demons pouring through the thinning veil of reality, howling their praise to gods of hunger and madness. Yet, far above this maelstrom, aboard the corrupted heart of the War Master's fleet, a silence deeper than death took hold. The vengeful spirit. Once the pride of the lunar wolves, it now drifted like a bloated corpse in the void, bloated on horror and heavy with damnation. The ship had become an extension of Horus's soul, twisted by the ruinous powers into a temple of corruption. Its bulkheads breathed, its halls wept blood. The warp curled tightly around it, nurturing it like a favored wound. And the Emperor had come aboard. He did not bring armies. He did not bring fleets. He came not as a general, nor as a god, but as a father. At his side, Sanguinius had gone ahead. The angel had sensed what lay at the heart of the vessel. He had felt it in his bones, in his dreams, fate calling him to a final reckoning. And it had claimed him. Sanguinius, the most beloved, the purest of them all, had fallen before Horus's throne. His blood was still steaming on the deck when the Emperor stepped over it. There was no grief in the Emperor's stride. There was no time left for grief. Across the shattered command bridge, Horus waited. He had shed all pretense. His armor was a living shrine to chaos, carved with glyphs of despair, adorned with screaming faces that begged and laughed and howled. The War Master's eyes were black holes, filled with shifting lights that suggested the endless screaming galaxies of the warp. His mouth curled in something close to a smile, but there was no warmth there. "Father," Horus said, "welcome." The words echoed in a dozen voices, some his own, some belonging to things far older, deeper, and darker than man. The Emperor did not respond. Words at this point were not weapons. They were shadows. The air itself trembled as they approached one another. Psychic pressure rippled outward in invisible waves, warping space and crushing reality. The bridge, already a nightmare, twisted even further. Time fractured. Gravity spun. But the duel had already begun. Horus struck first. Worldbreaker, the monstrous power claw that had claimed countless lives, descended in a blur of godlike speed. The Emperor parried it with a thought, pure psychic force wrapping around the claw, diverting it just enough. The recoil cracked the deck beneath his feet. Then came the counter-strike. The Emperor raised his hand and light lanced from his fingertips, sunfire focused through the lens of grief. It struck Horus squarely, tearing armor and flesh and soul. But the War Master did not scream. He laughed. A demon prince might have perished in that blow. Even a primarch would have been crippled. But Horus was more than both. He had become a conduit of the warp, and the dark gods screamed through him. They lent him power. They made him whole, and they wanted him to win. They wanted the Emperor to fall, not just in death, but in despair. What followed could barely be called a fight. It was something far greater. Two forces clashing that no longer obeyed the limits of the universe. Their wills collided in silence that tore the walls apart, in light that blinded demons, in sound that ruptured the hull of the mighty ship. Every blow the Emperor landed shook the web of chaos. Every counterstrike from Horus ripped wounds in reality itself. Terror wept below. The Imperium trembled. The gods watched, eager. And still, the Emperor held back. Not out of weakness, out of hope. The Emperor fought like a storm denied release. Every movement crackled with barely restrained fury, every breath a tidal wave of suppressed power. He could end it. He knew it. But every moment of restraint was a gamble, a hope clutched tightly in a dying hand, because to unleash everything would mean annihilating more than just the corrupted figure before him. It would mean obliterating his son completely. Not just his body, not just his mind, but his soul. It would mean denying Horus any chance at redemption, any memory, any echo, as if he had never lived at all. And so, he held back, even as Horus carved into his armor with the claw that had ended Sanguinius, even as black fire licked across his skin, even as his blood, burning, golden, splattered across the floor. The Emperor hesitated, and Horus knew it. He laughed, loud, cruel, full of victory and venom. But there was panic in it too. The gods howled louder now, sensing their moment of triumph. The War Master struck again, then again, each blow heavier, more brutal, echoing with the will of gods who demanded blood. The deck plate beneath them shattered, the very fabric of the ship screamed, and still the Emperor did not fall. Bent? Yes. Broken? Not yet. He saw flashes in the void behind Horus, not stars but illusions, memories. Ulanor, Luna, the bridge of the Gloriana vessel where Horus once spoke of dreams, of unity, of brotherhood. But those moments drifted further away now, like ash on wind. The thing before him was not his son, not anymore. But he waited, just a little longer, just a little more. One final chance. Then came the moment. It was not grand, not thunderous. It did not arrive with horns or choirs or screams. It arrived quietly. The chaos paused, the warp hiccuped, and Horus, snarling, triumphant Horus, paused mid-blow. His claw hung in the air, his mouth opened as if to roar again, and then closed. His eyes changed, and just for a heartbeat the storm died. In that breathless instant the veil tore, the gods recoiled, the corruption wavered, the shadows fell away, and the man beneath the monster returned. Horus Lupercal, son of the Emperor, first among brothers, bearer of the hopes of a species, looked down at his father, and he remembered. Tears welled in eyes no longer black voids. His claw trembled. The fanged grin slipped into something like grief, and for the first time in decades, Horus wept. "Father," he whispered. The voice was different now, smaller, human. "Father, what have I done?" The Emperor met his gaze, and there at last he saw it, the son he had loved, the soul he had hoped to save. The moment passed in a blink, but it was enough. Horus collapsed to his knees. "Please," he breathed, broken, exhausted. "Please, end this." The Emperor did not hesitate this time. He knew what it meant, what he must do. And so he rose, with every fiber of his being aflame with loss and truth and unbearable purpose. He summoned the full weight of his power. The palace behind him, the Imperium, the webway, mankind's future, all of it poured into him in that final irrevocable act. It was not a weapon. It was a judgment, a statement to the universe. This ends now. The blast was silent. It did not roar. It did not shake the ship. It simply was. It consumed Horus not in fire, but in truth. The truth of what he had become. The truth of betrayal and love and failure. Every whisper of demonic power clinging to him was torn away. Every favor of the gods was burned. The warp recoiled, the bridge fractured, and then there was nothing. No scream, no body, no soul. Horus Lupercal was gone, utterly, finally, completely, erased not in hate but in mercy. The silence that followed was not peace. It was absence. The Emperor stood alone in a place where reality had bled to death. The walls no longer shifted. The lights no longer screamed. The warp's influence had been scoured clean in a circle around him, burned away by the final act of a father who had tried, for so long, not to destroy his child, and in return had destroyed himself. He collapsed, not dramatically, not with flourish, just crumpled like a man too tired to stand. His body was wrecked beyond repair, flesh charred, armor shattered, bones powdered. His psychic presence, once a blazing sun, was now a dim ember flickering in storm-racked air. But he was still alive, and he was alone. It was Rogel Dorn who found him. The primarch of the Imperial Fists led the rescue aboard the dying flagship, forcing a teleport strike through the failing Geller field. His warriors had to cut through a dozen decks of demonic filth and twisted matter to reach the bridge. And there, in the ashes of a war that had broken gods, they found him, the Emperor of Mankind, bleeding gold. Sanguinius lay nearby, still and radiant, even in death. Horus was gone, and the Imperium had been bought, not with victory, but with sacrifice. They brought him back to Terra. They placed him on the Golden Throne, the only place that could contain what he had become. He never spoke again, but in that final moment aboard the Vengeful Spirit, he had made his choice. He had killed his son. He had saved his species, and he had doomed himself, not to death, but to eternity. The Golden Throne was never meant to be a tomb. It had been constructed for ambition, not vanity, but salvation. A masterwork to interface with the webway, an ancient mechanism that, if completed, would have freed mankind from the dangers of warp travel and the demonic horrors that fed upon it. It was meant to liberate humanity, to render the warp's sinister influence irrelevant. But it failed. Or perhaps more accurately, it was interrupted by betrayal, by pride, and by the War Master's fall. Now the throne was no longer a promise. It was a prison. When Rogel Dorn and his warriors stepped aboard the Vengeful Spirit, they found only wreckage, silence, and ash. The battle between father and son had torn through reality itself. But at the heart of it, on a scorched and blood-slick floor, lay the Emperor. Not victorious, not triumphant, barely alive. His armor was broken, the radiant gold dulled, warped, and blackened by demonic energies. One eye had been burned away. His psychic signature, once the burning light of an uncaring sun, had dimmed to a guttering flame, and Horus was gone. Nothing remained, no body, no voice, no echo, only the residue of God-slaying power and the stench of sacrifice. Dorn did not weep in that moment. He had no time to. There was only duty, the final expression of his Gene Father's will. The Emperor had given everything to preserve humanity. Now, Dorn would see to it that he endured. Teleportation back to Terra was rushed, chaotic, dangerous. The Astronomicon flickered wildly as the Emperor's soul unraveled at the edges. If he slipped into the warp, if he was lost, the Imperium would collapse. The gods would descend. They stabilized him, barely. And then came the hard truth. He could not be healed. There was no regenerating this. No apothecarian, no psychic rite, no advanced mechanicum rites could repair what had been done. His physical form was broken beyond mortal science. His mind had withdrawn, fragmented by the trauma of destroying Horus, of losing his son, and more profoundly, the dream he had built for mankind. So Malkador's throne, the Emperor's own unfinished device, became his coffin. The Mechanicum, the Adeptus Custodes, and the remaining loyalist elite transformed the Golden Throne from a portal stabilizer into a life support device for a god. Thousands of golden wires pierced his ruined flesh. Psychic coils hummed with energy that could kill suns. A choir of doomed psychers was established, the first of many, their life force feeding the Astronomicon, now solely reliant on the Emperor's flickering will. Malkador was gone. The Sigillite had given his life holding the webway breach, while the Emperor confronted Horus. None had ever known the extent of Malkador's strength until he was gone. Even his ashes had scattered into the warp as his soul burned out to buy time. Now, the Emperor sat on the throne, unmoving, silent. His lips never opened again, but he was not dead. Not yet. The throne room became a sacred space. The custodian guard established new protocols, no approach without ceremony, no unclean thought allowed to linger. It was not merely reverence. The Emperor's psychic presence, while faint, could still detect treachery. More than one scribe or official was turned to ash by his unconscious will in the early days. The High Lords of Terra were appointed in this vacuum. Politics returned, bureaucracy calcified. Guilliman, far away in the eastern fringe, would eventually codify the Imperium Secundus, believing the Emperor dead. It would take years before the truth reached him. And when it did, when Guilliman returned to Terra and saw his father's state, even he, the stoic ultramarine, was shaken. The Emperor's presence remained tethered to real space. That alone was a miracle. He kept the Immaterium at bay. Demons found it harder to manifest near Terra. The Astronomicon became the only navigational guide for humanity's ships. 1,000 psychers a day were sacrificed to maintain it. Their souls fed to the fire. Some screamed, some embraced their fate. All were necessary. The Emperor burned their essence not out of cruelty, but because there was no other way. He was no longer the man of unification, no longer the architect of the crusade, no longer the force who could wrestle gods from the heavens. He was broken, but he was enduring. Around him, the galaxy moved on. The traitor primarchs fled into the eye of terror. Their legions shattered or devolved into madness. The loyalist legions fractured, reorganized into chapters. The Codex Astartes became law, and the people began to pray, not in whispers, but in choirs. They built cathedrals, they crafted saints, they recited litanies that declared the Emperor's godhood, that he had willingly sacrificed his body to ascend. They believed he had become more than mortal, that he now guided their souls through the warp, that he heard their prayers. The truth? He could barely hear anything at all. Inside the throne, his mind waged war, not against armies, but against the warp itself. Every day, demons clawed at the edge of reality. The screams of the damned bled through the veil. He held them back with thoughts like blades and willpower sharpened by grief. He saw mankind's future, 1,000 possible dooms, civil war, Xenos resurgence, technological stagnation, the slow rot of the Imperium's soul. He could do nothing to stop it. But still, he watched, and still, he hoped. Some say he dreams, others say he sends visions. In the warp, saints and psychers alike claim to feel his gaze, sometimes warm, sometimes cold. He has not spoken a word since the siege of Terra, but the Imperium speaks enough for him. Too much. He never wanted this, not worship, not fanaticism. He had wanted unity, reason, enlightenment, humanity's liberation from the chains of superstition. Instead, they built a religion around his silence and made him a god. The Emperor of mankind had once walked among mortals. Now he was enthroned in gold and agony. A king of ashes, a god of wires and whispers. He was the broken god. And yet, somehow, impossibly, he endured. For humanity. For what he still believed we could become. Even if no one else remembered that dream anymore. He no longer speaks. He no longer walks. He no longer sees the stars. He once sought to unify beneath his golden banner. Yet, his presence endures. At the heart of Terra, buried beneath the mountains of marble and ferrocrete, surrounded by the greatest fortress in human history, the Emperor sits motionless upon the golden throne. His body, ruined by the duel with Horus, is no longer capable of action. His mind, once the most brilliant in the galaxy, now burns as a smoldering beacon through the Imperium, a psychic conflagration, fueled by pain, sacrifice, and a will that refuses to yield. He has become more than a man, more than a ruler, more than a father. He has become eternity itself. The Astronomicon, the psychic lighthouse that guides Imperial vessels across the warp, blazes only because of his continued existence. It is fed by sacrifice. Thousands of psychers every day are drained of their minds and souls to maintain the link between the Emperor and his psychic signal. Their deaths are not ceremonial. They are functional, calculated, the fuel of empire. Without him, that light would flicker and die. Warp travel would become suicide. The Imperium would fracture. The Xenos would descend. Chaos would feast, and humanity would vanish in the howling dark. The High Lords of Terra govern in his name. Bureaucrats, generals, ecclesiarchs, men and women of immense power, none of whom were chosen by the Emperor himself. His dreams of a rational, enlightened civilization are now interpreted through layers of doctrine, ritual, and dogma. Every word he once spoke is now sacred, every silence, a divine mystery. He had wanted a future without superstition, but his silence has become the greatest scripture of all. The imperial cult has grown from local reverence into a galaxy-spanning religion. Billions gather each day in cathedral hives to chant hymns in his name. The ecclesiarchy declares him the God Emperor of mankind, the eternal guardian of the human soul. Entire planets have been reshaped to reflect his image. Golden statues that rise for kilometers, carved into the sides of mountains or orbiting as space stations. To speak of him as merely a man is heresy. To question his divinity is death. And yet, for those who remember, those few scattered, hidden remnants who once knew him as he truly was, this worship is not comfort, it is tragedy. He had tried to prevent this. He had abolished faith. He had destroyed the old gods, the cults, the warp-revering sects that plagued mankind during the Age of Strife. He had taught that humanity did not need gods, that it could be its own salvation. He had denied his own divinity, not out of false humility, but because he believed in truth. Now truth is buried beneath incense and flame, and the Emperor remains silent. Does he know what the Imperium has become? Does he approve? No one can say. Some claim he weeps in his mind, chained to a galaxy that has misinterpreted everything he stood for. Others believe his silence is approval, that the great religion of the Imperium is the inevitable evolution of his vision. But the truth is lost to the warp. All that remains is what he has become. From his throne he watches, not with eyes, but with presence. In the warp, his psychic shadow is the strongest force of stability known to mankind. Where demons twist and claw, his light sears them into dust. Worlds blessed with his gaze feel it like warmth, like gravity. Astropaths speak of his voice in dreams. Saints claim to carry his will. There are entire orders within the Adepta Sororitas, whose sole duty is to interpret the silent messages of the throne. Some believe his mind reaches across the stars to inspire courage or to strike down the impure. Miracles are attributed to him, from warp storms parting to the resurrection of fallen warriors. How much of it is real? How much is the weight of faith? None can be sure. And still, he does not speak, but he endures. For 10,000 years he has endured. Empires rise and fall, but the Imperium survives because the throne endures. Alien invasions, Heretical uprisings, planetary exterminations, all are held back by his existence. Even the most cynical inquisitors admit if the Emperor were to finally die, the warp would consume mankind in a matter of weeks. That is not belief. That is fact. And yet, endurance is not the same as victory. The dream of the Great Crusade is shattered. Enlightenment has become repression. Reason has become zealotry. The Imperium is not the civilization he hoped to build. It is a brutal, inefficient, decaying empire, one that survives only because of fear, firepower, and faith. Every act of progress is buried under red tape, suspicion, or violence. And his sons, the primarchs, those he raised to lead, are lost to time. Some vanished, some corrupted, others dead. Only a few still walk the galaxy, and even they question whether their father remains aware of their presence. The truth is grim. The Emperor sits not because he chooses to, but because he must. His broken body is chained to life through ancient arcane machinery. His mind is a constant battlefield. He holds back the demonic tides from Terra itself. The eye of terror presses at the edge of reality. Without him, the warp would surge through the veil. Demons would walk freely in real space. The final war would begin. And so he sits, not in judgment, not in mercy, but in duty, still sacrificing himself day after day for a species that no longer understands what he gave up for them. Some believe a day will come when he rises again. The final awakening, they call it. When the Emperor's soul will burn bright once more, his body restored, his voice raised in command, he will lead mankind in a second great crusade, not for unification but for purification, for vengeance. Others say he is already dead, and that the throne now holds only a shadow. And then there are the radicals. Those who whisper that the Emperor could be reborn if only his body were destroyed and his soul allowed to reincarnate. Heresy of the highest order. Such voices do not speak long, but the hope remains that this is not the end, that he will not sit forever, that the Emperor will rise. But until that day comes, if it ever does, he remains, the last line between mankind and the abyss, the eternal flame at the heart of a dying empire, the dreamer, the warrior, the father, now the Emperor eternal, not by choice, but by necessity. And for now that is enough.